Good evening, should I say? God, yeah, it's that. It's January. You need to forgive me a little bit. Anyway, lovely to see so many of us here, actually. Thanks for that, and wish everybody a Happy New Year. Uh, uh, Without further ado, I think we'll actually just get started. Item 1, minutes. Oh, apologies, sorry.
So we have apologies from councillors Martin, Slade and Wells. And there's also one item to note is that I was made aware after the publication of the agenda that the item, which is the Huntingdonshire Place Strategy update, would allow for a better discussion of the rest of the items and better flow if we moved that to item 4. So is everybody in agreement that we just reorder the items so that we can then have a better flow of the discussion for the evening? Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, minutes. There were some changes to the minutes that were proposed. Have those been?
Apologies. They're not added into the minutes at this point because these minutes have already been, draft minutes have been published, but we can add them as an additional comment into the next set of minutes. Would you like me to read those out? We have some amendments, some comments from Councillor Gray, which are on minute item number 45, is that the recorded comments perhaps be better worded as expressed particular concern that none of the proposals had been developed. And item 51, which is the work programme, there wasn't as much update on there as perhaps was discussed, so I can just add the additional point on there for that one. And then item 49, which is for Councillor Taylor to attend scrutiny to discuss the financial performance of One Leisure. That will be happening in February, which, as you will all know from an email, but I wasn't proposing to minute that point, but that's just for clarification, if that's okay with everybody. Are those amendments okay with everybody? Is there anything additional to add?
Is that okay? Yes. Sorry.
I think we need the microphone on, unfortunately, though, for YouTube to hear you, is the problem. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you for your comments and your clarification. We will take it on board. Okay. Members' interests. No? Excellent. We can move on. Item 3, notice of key executive decisions.
So obviously the notice of key decisions is published there in the agenda. Are there any comments or questions on any of the items on there? Councillor Gray?
Probably just an observation, if I may, Chair, is that it looks a little thin, I suppose, is the feeling that I have when I look at it. It doesn't look to be a huge amount of forward-coming activity, but it may be that there's a lot up somebody's sleeve and it's all going to come tumbling out in the next municipal year. But I'd have expected to see a little bit more on there.
Thanks for that. Yes, we are actually looking to expand what actually comes to the committee, but thank you.
Place strategy.
Okay, so we're, as agreed initially, we're actually going to start off not with item 4, but we're actually going to go straight to item 8, the place strategy. Thank you.
Good evening. It's nice to see so many faces, and I don't think I've ever seen the gallery quite so full, which is wonderful. So I'm here to present an update on the Huntingdonshire Place strategy. As members, you'll know that this is an ongoing piece of work that we've been engaged in for some months, and it started with our original predecessor council. So we're very pleased to be able to take this forward. You'll know that it is something we are facilitating rather than thinking about it being an HDC badged policy strategy. It has to be owned by the whole community. That's what will make it effective. So this is about partnership working. This is about getting better impact because we are working across systems. This is about understanding what residents, what businesses really would like for our communities and what they would like to see in Huntingdonshire. And in doing this and setting out this big vision, then actually a lot of the other strategy work will fall and reflect those ambitions and those ideals that people have started to articulate, which is, I think, why you asked me to present first, with a view then that the work we might do on the local plan needs to reflect some of these themes in time. So what you have before you tonight is an update on the work that has been ongoing. It reflects the last period of activity. You'll see that we've held the last large engagement session, which was very well attended. What was really heartwarming to see was actually what was important wasn't just the ideas coming forward, it was the relationships that were being forged in those networking opportunities, with people talking to people they wouldn't normally have an opportunity to talk with, and people beginning to get into the space of what if. What if we could, rather than being constrained by some of the things that day to day cause us all practical challenges? And that's the territory we need to stay in. And we need to be really ambitious for Huntingdonshire. So certainly what you've got in front of you gives you an update of where we have got to, but is by no means a finished piece of work. It effectively tries to capture where we are at this point, give us a sense of direction, and will be something that will be a living and breathing piece of work that will be ongoing for at least the next 5 years, 10 years, and longer. But it will grow and change as our communities grow and change, as the world around us shifts, and as our priorities need to reflect those big ambitions. And some of those ambitions are emerging rapidly. So what you've seen in the papers that you have is an attempt to articulate that in a way that is fairly straightforward, given that the conversations we've had have been huge, wide-ranging. The issues people have brought to the table have been considerable. But what we've actually managed to give you is a sense of key themes, the idea of a journey, something that will emerge over time, around which we will cluster the activity that supports those end goals. So that's what you have in front of you. I hope it's fairly self-explanatory, but as I've said, this is not the end of a conversation, it is ongoing. I know that a number of members came to the member session, and there is another member session planned in the next couple of weeks, which I hope will see more members coming to join us, and some returning. Because just because you've been once, please don't think that it's not an invite to come and join us again. And I think what's really heartening is actually just the general level of buzz around the art of the possible, what we might do, what we could do. So you've got before you the strategy as it stands. I wasn't going to go through it in great detail. Your agenda pack tonight is huge. But I'm very happy to stop and take some questions and some feedback and some reflections, because this is certainly an important document. It's the overarching strategic view about where we are going. And once we are clear that this is the right journey to be taking, then actually this is about taking others with us on that journey. And sometimes we might be in the lead, and sometimes we might follow others who are leading because they are better placed. What I certainly think it will do, and we're already seeing the benefits coming forward, is we know that from time to time there are opportunities to do things on our patch that we would love to do, but actually being able to articulate them clearly, being able to evidence the desire to do new work and why, is really important when we're looking to secure new funding for new activity. So this will be an important driver for helping us move forward and seizing those opportunities, but being very clear they are based on what our communities are telling us are needed and wanted. So I'm going to pause there and take any questions if there are any, or any reflections.
Thank you, Chair. I think the strategy casts a really compelling vision, and I'd like to thank the officers and those who've worked on it for what I think is, on the whole, a really positive and attractive, vision of the future. But I'd just like to comment on one of the pathways which I think could be viewed as a bit of a negative, and that's the suggestion. It's on page 446 in the pack, that the car should be a relic of the past. And the sentiment behind it and the supporting detail, I think, is much more realistic and pragmatic than that, and I fully support it. But the headline, which I think is all that many people will see, suggests a future in which we'll be forced to live without our cars. And I think that would be unthinkable to residents, particularly in rural areas, and those who rely on them for a variety of reasons. I think the vast majority of the other pathways are irrefutably positive and achievable, rather than just being aspirational. But I think that one stands out as being a bit pie in the sky. So I wonder whether it might be better reframed around one of its more positive and achievable aspects, such as better public transport networks or infrastructure for active travel.
Chair, if I may respond. So it's really interesting because lots of us picked that up too. And it was a real discussion point when it came up at the workshops. And one of the conversations we had was, well, actually, why is it not possible? Now, we know in lots of communities it's not practical. It's probably not going to be feasible because of the nature of some of our geography. In an urban area, it might be much easier to find alternative transport methods and use active travel. If you're out in a very rural area, a very isolated area, then actually you are still going to need some form of personal transport, and it is likely to potentially to be a car, then maybe a bicycle or a motorbike or another form of transport. And certainly if the buses are not running in the way that we would wish them to, that's another part of the picture. I think what it does though do is provoke the thought of, well, what would it take to find alternatives? And equally, do we really mean that we want a vision where there is no car? And I think the answer is actually most residents would say that they're not ready for a vision with no car. What they'd like is sometimes is an alternative so they can make a choice. But one of the things we were talking about in the member session, and it actually came from members, and I think it might have been even from some of the people in this room, was what if you could, in a rural area, take your car a relatively short distance and then pick up another connection? Pick up a train, pick up a bus, pick up a tram, pick up an electric automated vehicle, whatever the future looks like. But what if you could do that and you didn't have to go all the way to a market town to do it, all the way to one of our cities to do that? And what if actually the hubs were nearer and the distances to access those were shorter? So I think the answer is it's thought-provoking, but I take your point. I think we might want to message it more positively. I think that's entirely right. But it is actually interesting because it is quite thought-provoking, isn't it? And it does provoke a response. We all kind of throw our hands up in horror. But also, one of the real challenges is the technology is changing all of the time. We think of cars as they are today, not cars as they will be even in 5 years. So we think of cars as being mostly driven by fossil fuels. With some electric cars coming on stream, it is quite possible within the next 5 years, actually, we will see the technologies shift dramatically. And that might change perceptions about whether we think cars are good or are bad things. So thank you. I'll take that back. And it did the job it was there to do, which is to get the attention. But I agree with you. Perhaps a slightly more positive wording would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any more questions? Councillor Gray.
Right. The masses can hear. So just probably if I could just start with a question, because you've been working very closely with Kate on this, and obviously with the recent announcement, what's the plan there in terms of who's going to be leading with you on the officer side?
I think mine, that's it. I'm now on. Thank you. That's a very good point. So the transition of and change of staffing is a very important one. We are working really hard at the moment, and Kate would have been here tonight. She's not very well today. We're working really hard to front load the activity so that ahead of her departure, we already know what we're going to be doing for the next 3, 4, 5 months, so that actually we should be able to keep that momentum going while we have a change of personnel. We have a clear handover plan, and we are out to recruit at the moment. So getting somebody in post who understands that vision and the importance of the place strategy is crucial. You'll be involved in that, which is, I hope, reassuring to you. But clearly, we need a very good field from which to recruit. And you're right, it will be a key role because this is the overarching strategy that we are facilitating. So our ability to continue to facilitate is important, but it will also move into a slightly different phase. The next phase will be around that wider networking because we will actually have documentation to build from. It will then be about that practical moving forward about who comes together to do what and how we harness that enthusiasm and use that to drive forward that vision. But you're right, it will be really important we get the right person and we get them in post as quickly as we can.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was starting with a question, but then I've got a few observations, if I may. So, is that all right, Chair? So, firstly, I mean, I want to thank you for the work that you put in front of us, and I would agree with Councillor Pickering that it's set out very well. I think I very much like the journey, the pathways. I think it's set out nicely. Um, I don't fully agree with everything that's written down there in the journeys and the pathways. I would have expressed it slightly differently, but I think broadly I would totally agree that it sets a very optimistic tone. So I will welcome that, being an optimistic person by nature. So well done on the format, well done on the layout, and as you said, this is an iteration, not a completion at this point in time. I have probably some reservations, though. I think the first one would be, as I said, I'm optimistic, but it looks to me like you're kind of trying to boil the ocean here, really, a bit, in terms of everything that's written down here. And I think we have to be realistic about what we are able to achieve as an authority, what our bandwidth is with the constraints that we've got and the resources that we have available. And whilst frankly the energy levels of people to be able to drive transformational change forward. And I think that's just something that I would encourage you to go away and reflect upon, because I think of the 20 things that sit there, which of those do you personally have a number one or a number two in each of those journeys, that you feel, well, actually that's what I would really want to stake this council's reputation on. I think that would be probably useful to reflect on. I would question whether all of the pathways reflect the views of a majority of Huntingdonshire residents. I think it is worth reading them very closely, and I did do you the honour of doing that over the last couple of days, and thinking that if I went out there and genuinely pulled the man off the Huntingdon omnibus and said, is this what you really think Huntingdonshire is all about, whether they would subscribe to that. I'm not doubting that this is the ambition of the coalition of parties that you lead. I'm questioning whether or not they are the priorities of the majority of the people of Huntingdonshire. And I think we just need to think about that. And in addition to that, I suppose I would point to the engagement that's been done. There's quite a useful kind of timeline of chart that you've done on the way through there, which is really interesting. I have a feeling that there's probably a little bit of merging between the climate strategy consultation and Huntingdonshire Futures consultation going on there. The business community hasn't been consulted at this particular point in time, from what I can see. That's been cancelled. At least two of the pathways make very strong references to farming and to the rural economy. The easiest thing in the world is to pick up the phone to the NFU and have a consultation with them. I don't see them engaged into the process. So I wonder whether, despite the work that you're doing, and I know the genuine desire that you have to consult, whether we're really reaching out into all of the areas that we need to get the best answers in these various areas that we're discussing, which, as I said, broadly, I think are very aspirational and very laudable. I think the final point that I would make is on page. I'm just looking at your presentation, so I'm looking at page 4. of the appendix, which says what we heard, the introduction, what we heard. I think it's really interesting to see what you've reflected on there about what we've heard. The question I've got and the challenge I would put back to you, Sarah, would be about that final point about identifying where we can be leaders, because I think that is a really important aspect. As I've said already, let's prioritize the things that we really believe in and think that we can do. And I just wonder whether or not Huntingdonshire, of all the places in the United Kingdom, is going to be the leader on a transition away from reliance on the car. Given the nature that we've already discussed, I think there are other local authorities who are going to be the pioneers, and one might not be very far from our doorstep here, in being a genuine leader on how to move away from reliance on the car. And I would agree with the comments that were made earlier. Um, Pioneer the transition towards the circular economy. I'm not sure I know what a I think I have some vague ideas of what a circular economy is, but I'm pretty sure the average punter in Huntingdonshire doesn't know what a circular economy is and what that actually implies and means for them. And then the last point, which will really lead into to the Clara show, the Clara and Tom show that we've got going later on, encourage sustainable growth by building responsibly. Very laudable aspirations, but can we be leaders in that? Because our hands are tied by so often, as you know only too well, what is coming out of central government. So I just feel that identifying where we can be leaders is a really good thing to do, because that's absolutely what we should be doing. I just question whether those three things there, the second one enlightened me, but numbers 1 and numbers 3, I'm just not sure we're placed to do that. But crossroads for distribution, absolutely. Startups, entrepreneurship, Cambridge just on our doorstep, fantastic. Lifelong learning, brilliant. Loads of good stuff in there. Can thoroughly get behind all of that, but probably just question 1 or 2 bits of emphasis. Thank you for your patience, Chair.
Like I say, if I may, Chair, thank you very much for those observations. The credit really does go to officers. The officer team have been fantastic in pulling this together, and those that have partnered with them. The interesting thing is, this isn't, if you like, the joint administration's priorities. This is what that engagement piece has told us. So we haven't, if you like, pre-edited it and said, this is all the things we're going to do as a joint administration. This is the priorities that came out of those conversations. They did include the man on the omnibus or the woman on the omnibus. I don't know whether they were actually on a bus at the time. It did include members of the business communities. I'm fairly confident it involved members of the farming communities. Did it involve everybody? No, but there was a really good effort to try and get the message out and to get that engagement. Does that engagement stop? No, it has to be ongoing. And the answer is those conversations have to continue. Is Huntingdon District Council going to lead all of those? Absolutely not. That's not the point of the strategy. The point of the strategy is, if that's the ambition, who's best placed to lead it? Do we have a part in that? Do we facilitate that? Do we partner in that? Is it actually better led by somebody else so that we can focus on the things that actually we can do something about and we can lead on? This is about collectively getting a better impact across Huntingdonshire and actually looking at what we do. I take your point about, and it comes back to the point that Councillor Pickering made about, some of the emphasis that came from our public engagement. So some of that comes from those voices you were hearing that sort of said, actually, what if we could do without the car? I agree with you. Some of these things are practically quite difficult for us, but there are big aspirations. And I think the real challenge for us is actually working out where our partners are. Who's going to lead on what and how? How can we get the climate right for those partners to thrive? We lead on sort of some of the agri-tech stuff in this part of the country. How do we play our part in helping those partners to thrive? And that then leads back into things like our local plan. So what might we do in our local plan that encourages those businesses to do really well and maybe relocate here or grow here? And what does growth look like? And what sort of other infrastructure would you need around them? So it's it's taking those ideas that have come from this and then thinking, how do we play our part in policy terms? What could we do that would be positive and proactive and supportive? And equally, where it's not us, how can we make sure that Huntingdonshire is at the forefront when somebody else can do it? So, in other words, making sure our other partners are doing the bits they can do, that we are lobbying and speaking up for Huntingdonshire when it's actually a different partner or a different bit of government that has to do something that we can't do ourselves, but we can articulate that this is what our residents would like us to be talking about, and it's important, and that's the bit that we have to do. So I hope that answers it. And there will be some things that we will do as a joint administration. That's sort of the next part of the journey together. All 52 of us actually deciding of all the things we can do. What are the things that are really, really important? And equally, where are the quick wins? Because I think certainly what came out of a lot of the workshops was there are some things we could do really easily in communities. It doesn't have to be us as district council or councillors doing it. We actually might just need to get the right people talking to each other because there's already a will. They just don't know who to have the conversation with to take that bit of activity forward. So it's trying to be strategic, big picture, hugely ambitious, but some of it is quick win practical stuff that if we help facilitate, we could get people moving on it quite quickly. I hope that gives you some reassurance, but thank you for all the positives, and I will take away those comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any more questions on this paper? Okay. Well, in light of how we moved before, if I might just summarize the discussion, and then obviously we'll have a show of hands. I mean, what I've taken away from this discussion tonight is, in principle, everybody's in agreement. I think everybody would recognize that some of the points are aspirational. And obviously, I think the point is dealing with things that we can are within our control and we can facilitate, recognizing that we are actually just facilitators at this point. It's a complete iterative process, and communication, I think, was one of the issues coming up, making sure that we actually expand that communication. So those were the things I think that this committee, I think, would perhaps like to make that recommendation, taking it forward to Cabinet. So are we just approving the contents, bearing in mind the comments that I've just pulled together? Can I have a show of hands? Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Can I just ask a point of clarification? We're not asked anywhere to vote on papers, and I want to understand why we started showing hands.
Okay.
It's just to make sure that it's clear for the committee and the minutes that everybody is actually in favour and that nobody has abstained but not actually said so much. It's been an observation and it's been taken on board that it was and it's been agreed by both chairs of the panels and senior management that there will be agreement given at the end of each item, just to make sure that everyone is in agreement with the item so that we're clear for the minutes.
So I understand that, but we're asked to note. So you're asking me to agree to a paper, which I think we've all said we like the tenor of it. We think it's very positive, but we're not being asked to agree anything here. We're being asked to note and give our comments.
It's just to it's the wording of the report that it's to make sure that you're in agreement in principle with the recommendations, so that there's no particular objections. Is just the gist of that.
I think this is just to make sure that everyone gets the opportunity just to make comments and they don't feel perhaps that they've been excluded. And that's my understanding on the comments. Possibly not this committee, okay, or the members. Thank you. So moving on, can I have a show of hands? Thank you. Thank you. Now, returning to the agenda. Yeah. Returning to the agenda, we'll go back to item 4, so which is the local plan review.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. Happy New Year to all members. It's good to be with you this evening. I think you know most of the officer team, but do you just want to introduce yourselves as well?
Is that the right one? Yeah. Hello, I'm Frances Schultz, Senior Planning Policy Officer.
Hello, I'm Claire Bond. I'm the Planning Policy Team Leader.
Good evening, members. Clara Kerr, Chief Planning Officer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We're here to present the report for the local plan review and the proposed update. This is obviously 3 separate but interconnecting reports. So we'll be dealing with the issues separately. I think the first one really just gives an overview, a summary of why we think we need to review and update the local plan. Obviously, the other ones will be looking at sustainability, consultation as we go through the process. So I think really just to open up and summarise, it's clear that things have changed a lot in the planning system since this was last done. We're almost at the end of the 5-year period, or we will be soon. National policy is changing. You'll probably see in the papers that the new homes target is now 950 homes, up from 805. National planning policy framework changes coming in there. And I think it's key that we keep up with those changes, that we have robust policies. We don't want to go back into tilted balance. Those of you who've sat on DMC will remember those days, which were quite difficult for the panel. And obviously, if we go to appeal, we have those robust policies in place. The 5-year housing supply as well is key part of that. Infrastructure improvements, impact on the environment, and also the Oxcam ARC, just some of the very key policies. So I'll hand over to Clara and Claire for a more detailed summary, and then we'll happily take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Just if I can just reiterate again, okay, because there are 3 papers, we'll just take one at a time. Otherwise, it'll get very confusing. So as Councillor Ferguson, Tom said, Sanderson said, we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. What we've got in front of us in the first of these 3 papers is the actual review of the local plan as it stands at the moment, and then a recommendation to start an update on it. The review is basically the result of us putting the current local plan through a systematic process to assess it against current national legislative and policy requirements to see how it performs in light of the changes that have come in since its preparation and adoption. Obviously, when we did the local plan at the time, we managed to scrape in under the transition arrangements on the 2012 MPPF. There was already a new MPPF by the time we actually got to examination and adoption. So we were on the tail end of the last one, and we were on the 3rd iteration of the MPPF since. So there have been quite a lot of changes to pick up. Section 3 of the report summarises the outcomes of the review, which is based on a nationally recognised toolkit that we've run it through. In terms of summarising the reasons for those and why we think it would benefit from a comprehensive update, obviously there's quite a lot of national and emerging legislative change and policy changes to realign with. The most significant of these is probably the adoption of the revised standard method for calculating housing requirements. When we did the current local plan, you had to work out your own housing requirements based on local evidence. The 2018 MPPF brought in a standard method for doing it nationally. The numbers for that vary every year depending on different affordability ratios and so on. But at the moment, the figure that we'd be looking at would be around 950. I think the highest it's been here has been just over 1,000. 950 is currently the lowest it has been. The 5-year housing land supply that we have to maintain at the moment is produced each year. The tests for that from May next year will go up to that higher figure once we reach 5 years from the point of adoption. So obviously, once we're testing against a higher figure, it's harder to maintain a 5-year supply, and therefore there's a greater risk of moving into the tilted balance. As we're all well aware, producing a new local plan is not a rapid job. I think the last one took just over 7 years, so we're hoping to get through this one in 6 and work our way down each time. So if we start now, we will start off very soon with a call for sites, and we'll start to have a much better idea of land that is coming in to be available for development. When we did the last local plan and the call for sites early on, we found some of those easier and more obvious sites came through and obtained planning permission before we ever got to examination and adoption, which, although may seem a little backwards, can actually help us keep that 5-year supply maintained. In terms of housing delivery, our numbers at the moment are actually quite good. Where we are struggling is delivery of sufficient affordable housing. So doing a review, or more to the point, an update of the local plan would allow us to reconsider our priorities for affordable housing in terms of the percentage sought, the distribution, the viability of it, and the impact of the overall level of growth on the amount of housing, affordable housing that we can bring forward. Obviously, another major factor that's changed since the local plan was adopted was the environmental context for it and the massively enhanced emphasis at both local and national levels on responding to the climate emergency and protecting the natural environment. Some elements of this will be addressed through national policy changes anyway, before we could ever reasonably expect to adopt a new local plan, but we would be able to apply locally generated priorities to those policies. There are a couple of sites in there, including one for something like 1,600 houses at RAF Alconbury, which are now known to be undeliverable. Ermine Street in Huntingdon is also delayed due to transport infrastructure challenges. So jointly, they will have an impact on the long-term deliverability of the spatial strategy. We've got a lot of unexpected economic uncertainty from Brexit and the pandemic. So there have been a lot of changes in the nature of demand for land, how town centres work, employment sites, and the current policies don't support some growth and changes that might now be desirable. A minor point, but applies to a lot of the development management policies, are changes to the planning use classes and permitted development rights. So they've actually reduced the clarity of guidance in some of our policies, where we obviously use the use classes that were in place at the time, but now they have changed and there's quite a bit of crossover between them. So going through all those more detailed policies as well gives us a chance to update those sort of details to provide much more clarity for the reader and to allow us to do a comprehensive review and make sure there's no unintended consequences of if, for example, we took the route of a partial review and we do part of the plan, we do the strategic element and think, oh, we'll leave the development management ones, but there will always be consequences that fall out. So we're recommending that we do a full update on that basis because we can make those smaller changes as well as the large ones, so we get a coherent and comprehensive update of it. It also makes the engagement and examination on the local plan much more straightforward because we don't have to explain to people, no, you can't comment on that policy, and that site that you don't like, because we want to keep those. And therefore it makes both the engagement and the examination much more straightforward if we're just doing the whole lot in one go. In terms of the report itself, paragraphs 5.1 to 5.5 identify the risks of not preparing an update, not least of which, as there is experience around this table, is engagement of the tilted balance being probably the greatest risk of all. Anything you want to add, Clara?
Thank you for that overview. Are there any questions? Councillor Corney.
Thank you, Chair. I, I welcome seeing this coming through. Obviously, as we've heard, obviously, I remember Tilted Balance only too well, and it was actually sat in this room at an appeal that got me into this mess in the first place. To be fair, coming to stand up for some of my neighbours, and here I am, a councillor. So I do welcome it. I want to keep away from those dreaded words, but Councillor Martin, Ross is not here this evening, but it's something we've both discussed since the agenda come out, and that's how when we go through this process, what impact this has on neighbourhood plans. Obviously, a bit later on in the agenda today, we've got Great Gransden. I mean, they're obviously they're a step ahead. I know Sawtry, they're not far behind. You know, they're coming up next. Ramsey have got a lot of data there. There's a couple of councillors there that, like to revisit the whole idea of a neighbourhood plan and push forward. But it'd just be interesting to know how the local plan as that comes through that affects the neighbourhood plans, if that makes sense, because people are putting a lot of effort into these, and it'd be horrible if something come along and it supersedes it quickly, and maybe then there could even be something that we could work together on that make it a little bit better, better all round anyway. But just picking those things up, please.
Yes, the clerk.
The NPPF, the guidance will tell us that whichever is the newest plan will take precedence. So a current neighbourhood plan would still stand because it's the newest if it was adopted since the local plan, which many of them are. As I said, it will take best part of 6 years to get a new local plan through. So any neighbourhood plans done in that time will have full weight. Once we adopt a new local plan, it will supersede any neighbourhood plan, but only in terms of where there is a conflict in a policy. So if the local plan has got a policy that would have a different stance on something than a neighbourhood plan policy, then if the local plan is newer, that would take precedence, but only where there's a conflict. Otherwise, every other element of the neighbourhood plan would stand. It only applies to strategic policies because they're the only policies of the local plan that a neighbourhood plan is required to align with. So all the development management type policies that you'll often get in a neighbourhood plan would still have their full weight regardless. One of the advantages of the new local plan is we would be required to work out housing numbers for any designated neighbourhood plan area. So we'd be able to give people a clear idea of the numbers they were going to aim for if they're looking to put housing in there. And obviously, once we've got a new local plan through, the team would have more capacity again to support updates to neighbourhood plans where people wanted to make those updates. Depending on the scale of them, they do or don't have to go through a full examination. And then they'd be newest again and would trump any conflicts anyway.
Thank you for that. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. My question's about the resources, because we know that the planning department's under a lot of pressure at the moment. Are we going to have enough resources to dedicate to a full rewrite of the local plan, or can we get away with just updating the odd bits and pieces? And also, we mentioned we've got the reserve to cover costs, but is that reserve going to be high enough to cover all the costs associated?
Thank you, and a helpful question. Under the heading of resources, I suggested those two themes, people and finance, as you've rightly identified. We do have a reserve for the local plan. It is a statutory function of local authorities up and down the country, and we're aware that they are costly exercises to do. So the burden on us really is to make sure that we are using our money effectively and achieving the outcomes that we need to make sure that we are developing those evidence bases for our local plan. So with that in mind, as part of the MTFS, we do set aside money into the local plan reserve annually. And where we have an underspend on the growth side of the planning budget, that will be diverted into the reserve. I will be honest in that the reserve is anticipated in 2027 for what I would call, excuse the phrase, an average local plan. But Clearly, as this local plan over its 6-year period, as we continue to engage publicly and with the political space as well, depending on the scale and nature of ambition, we will need to track that alongside with the MTFS. But for the here and now, for where we are in the local plan process, yes, we have a reserve. Yes, we can look to proceed, but it is incumbent upon all of us to demonstrate value for money in how we spend our local plan reserve. Turning to the point on people, we do have a small but perfectly formed team. This is the team that took us through the last local plan. And it is interlinked to my previous point as well in terms of scale, ambition. There will be pressure points inside the local plan, and then there'll be periods where there will be less pressures, notwithstanding that this team isn't just about the local plan. As you know, neighbourhood planning comes into that, and of course, pan-regional engagement on strategic matters is obviously a critical element of the team. We will need to monitor that, but it's also how we closely work with other departments. We don't do a local plan in isolation. Clearly, we work very closely with colleagues across the council. So it's how we set out our programme of work, look at what we need and when we need it, and of course, continue that close conversation with the political space as we approach various budget rounds and make sure that we are forecasting that appropriately. But for where we are now in starting the local plan, yes, I'm confident we have the resources.
Thank you, Clara. Any more questions? Yeah.
Chair, Clara said obviously we don't do this in isolation, so there'll be other departments. If we're talking about open space, for example, we'll be dealing with the ops team, economic development as well, potentially. So, we'll have an impact on our resources, but I think we've done a very good job over the years of ensuring we have reserves in place. And as Clara said, we've got a small team, but a very effective one, I think.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. My question's concerning the timetable and the proposed public engagement to commence in February, which obviously isn't very far away. I'm presuming this is later in February, and also the duration, 6 weeks. Is that sufficient? Bearing in mind if it is late February, this could well go into the Easter period as well. Thank you.
Thank you. You may see a bit of a joint effort with myself and Claire on this point. In terms of February, clearly we heard the conversation regarding the place agenda before this item. We need to work closely with our colleagues in terms of their anticipated timescales as well before we define a date in February. But we are very alive to the point of holidays, particularly Easter holidays, and we're well versed in that in the planning space. The anticipation is that we avoid the Easter holiday, that we will proceed ahead of that. But the key this time round with the 6 weeks is that this is the very, very start of the process. And what we are quite keen to embed as we move forward, that as we progress through the local plan, there will be statutory pinch points that will only allow 6-week consultation points. So to a certain extent, this is giving people the opportunity to get used to that drumbeat of consultations relating to local plan last 6 weeks. Our experience in the last local plan perhaps was that when sometimes these landed when there was pressure points like Christmas or Easter, the legislation didn't give us the flexibility to allow parish councils who, for example, don't meet in August or have extended breaks over December. For want of a better phrase, we can't accommodate those requests at specific points in the local plan. However, conversely, where we do have flexibility within some key consultation points within the local plan where we can extend, we will. But the thinking at this point, given what the consultation is about, is that it's a helpful start in helping parish councils get back into that drumbeat of understanding 6 weeks for local plans. And then clearly where we can, and we'll come on to the theme of communication later, where we can and where the regulations allow us to give longer periods of consultation, we will of course look to build on those where we can.
Thank you for that update. Any more? Councillor Pickering, mate. Councillor Pickering.
Thank you, Chair. This is building to some extent on the resourcing question. Obviously, we're less than 4 years since the current plan was adopted, and we're looking at a full rewrite. So I'm just wondering if we have any expectations for how long we expect this iteration to last before another rewrite. And clearly we don't have a crystal ball, but it's probably not unrealistic to expect a change of central government next year. And I'm wondering if there are things that we can do to future-proof the plan or mitigate against changes to legislation that we might expect to come down the track in the future. Or do we just resign ourselves to the fact that we're going to have to repeat the exercise again, after any changes to legislation next year?
Thank you. And that's a really helpful question. And it probably picks up some of the points that Claire raised earlier as well about us anticipating as much as we can, such as the use class order, for example, changes that have been made. Other matters we know about, such as the Environment Act of 2021 and what that's going to enact later in the year and the expectation there. Future building standards as well, how they come into primary legislation and how we make sure that we're reflecting those changes. But to your substantive point, we will never know everything at all of the time. And I can absolutely tell you that Claire and I have sat at our desks where legislation has changed at midnight the night before, and we've not been able to issue decisions the next morning that would have otherwise gone. But to the best of our abilities, we absolutely try and forecast. We also work very closely with our neighbours across Cambridgeshire. There is method in our madness and our timing as well, because there are others who will go before us, and we will happily harvest the learning from their experience and make sure that we embrace that as part of how we progress. Simply put, we will never know everything all of the time. What I should say as well is that we are obliged to review existing local plans every 5 years. That doesn't mean a new local plan has to start at every point. It will be what is the prevailing legislation at the time and what are we forecasting. In this scenario, as Claire rightly highlights, we were examined in 2018, but because of the timeline at which we were laying the foundations, if you like, and preparing that, linked to the NPPF 2012, in all honesty, we knew at that point there was an NPPF coming out in 2019, but for the amount of work that had been carried out and the evidence bases that were developed and the fact that we were in tilted balance, it made far more sense to proceed to examination and to be adopted to get us out of that predicament. But again, speaking frankly, we're not alone in this regard. In fact, we're doing better than some other authorities who have been allowed to adopt on the proviso that they immediately started a plan. We have not been in that position. What we're doing here is, in fact, trying to address the substantive point you raise and minimize the risk of tilted balance in 3-4 years' time, so that we minimize any risk of reliving that experience.
Thank you for that update, actually. I found that very helpful. Councillor Gray.
Jess, you'll be pleased to hear briefly from me. Firstly, a huge thank you for the report. I think it's excellently written. For the new councillors amongst us, you're looking at a very experienced team here, and I think the answers to the questions that have been coming thus far certainly should be giving you a lot of confidence that we're in safe hands at this point. And I think there is only one conclusion that you can draw from this report, which is that a new full plan needs to be embarked upon. I guess it's a bit like sort of launching a new cruise liner or something like that. And right now we've got a blank sheet of paper in front of us, and we are literally. I mean, it is as we've heard, almost as complicated as that. You're putting drawings together, and eventually something gets put on a slipway, and eventually it gets launched. And there's a huge amount of work that lies in front of us. But I think it's the right thing to do. I think just trying to pretend that these are sort of we can get away with sort of some sort of local plan amendment at this point in time would be wrong. So it's got my full support to progress along these lines.
Thank you. I'd like to reiterate that. I think it's a very comprehensive and excellent plan. Are there any more questions? I'd like to then summarise effectively. I think everyone's in agreement that the plan is good, comprehensive, and we would make recommendation to Cabinet. Can I have a show of hands? Any issues? Show of hands, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Item 5.
Yes, we're now going on to the second paper. Item 5, the Statement of Community Involvement.
Thank you, Chair. Yep, this is the second of our trio, the community statement of community involvement. Obviously, it sets out how the planning, how local planning authorities will engage with the community on planning matters. Very key part of what we do, consulting with residents, other local authorities, key stakeholders. You heard earlier regarding our place strategy. It's key that we get that process right. It will shape the future of our district. That's set out in the 2004 Act, and again says every 5 years it needs to be reviewed. It needs to reflect the council's approach to the upcoming local plan preparation and consultation stages. And I'll hand over to Francis, who's going to take us through the detail. There's a very detailed appendix as well if you have any questions on that.
The statement of community involvement sets out how the local planning, how we are going to engage with the community on planning matters. It covers a variety of different planning matters, including preparation of local plan documents, supplementary planning documents. It also discusses and looks at planning application process. Neighbourhood planning, and it covers a little bit about the Brownfield Land Register. It is a procedural document. It's something that we are legally required to do through legislation. It sets out what we are going to do to fulfil our legal obligations. This is not to say that as we go through the planning policy process and as we put together and consult on other documents that we won't do more. We will look at other ways to engage the public, but this is just a way of setting out what our formal obligations will be, what is set out in legislation, and how we are going to approach those issues. The document goes into a number of different chapters. Obviously, I've covered those to a certain extent. The production of planning policy documents, neighbourhood planning, which there is already a guide out there, which is produced separately and linked through our web pages to say how much support and guidance we will provide to parish and town councils. How the public can be involved in the planning application process, a little bit about monitoring and review. And I think that's really all I can say at the moment, but I'm open to receive any questions.
Thank you for the update. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Just that an observation really. We've had the Market Town master plans consultations, and the deadlines for those had to be extended for St Ives particularly. Is there any scope at all to extend the deadline for the consultation on this?
Thank you. I think that links to the conversation we had on the previous item as well. I believe the fundamental difference between this and perhaps the Market Town's strategy work, I'm not close to that, so I don't have a view on that, but certainly from a local plan perspective, we are at the very, very start here. This is the blank page. So hopefully the fact that we're starting this way in itself and linking to the previous item where we're trying to embed that theme of 6 weeks and getting parish councils used to that, that's what we're trying to achieve here. In addition, as well, what I would say is, assuming that this will go through Cabinet, if it goes through Cabinet, there is a question then as to how we take it away, how we promote in advance of the consultation to the towns and the parishes that this is coming so that they can plan for it appropriately.
Thank you, Clark.
If I could just add an additional point there, the statement of community involvement is not, we are not legally required to consult on the statement of community involvement, and many councils will just go out there, write their document, publish it, and say, that's it, that's a done deal basically. But what we have done is taken under advisement some guidance that says that it would be a good idea to consult the public on this document. So we have gone above our kind of statutory obligations by suggesting that this goes out to public consultation.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Gray.
Just very briefly, really. I mean, obviously this is fairly sort of boilerplate and standard, I think, really, in terms of there, and it looks to be fairly future proof in the way that you've written it. So, I've got no real concerns about it. I guess for us, the challenge is, how do we make this kind of alive during the consultation process? Certainly, because there are one or two things there that are, this is the ideal of how the planning system should work. Not necessarily how the planning system is actually working at this point in time. And I think we probably just need to be prepared for the fact that if we go out and consult on that, some people may well come back and say it would be really nice if you were actually doing X, Y, or Z. And this is not meant to be a critical comment, but I think it is reality as I've read through here, as saying, well, this is the nirvana of how planning should read. But broadly speaking, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that we should be putting out there, because it sets out what we should be doing. And, as I said, it looks like it can flex around all of the various things that may change nationally and locally. But just be prepared possibly for some interesting reactions.
Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chair. Just a follow up, really, in terms of how we're going to communicate this and get communities engaged. Can I suggest that some simple briefings for members, for us when we're attending parish councils and whatever, because to put this document in front of a parish council, some will read, some will not read it. I think if there's a sort of continual stream of simple messaging that we could deliver on behalf of HDC, I attend all my parish councils every month, so it's a useful way to make sure they're on board and they understand what the timetable's like and what's coming up next and when the next crunch point might be. That would be useful.
I think, Chair, that is this on? Yep. I think that's a very good idea of Councillor Corley's there, and to pick up on a point Councillor Gray made under the place strategy, getting the person on the Huntingdon omnibus interested and involved is going to be a key challenge, isn't it? And planning means different things to different people, and I'm sure we will get some negative feedback. It's the nature of what we do, nature of local government, isn't it? But a lot of many positive things, I think, going on, and we want to continue those. And I think we've seen already the drawbacks of not doing this. I think they could be considerable, and I think if that's better known, and certainly we can feed that back to members so they can update their parish councils.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Any comments? I think the feeling of the meeting is like very supportive of the whole document, and I think other than no general comments, other than as Councillor Cawley has actually suggested, a member briefing so we can actually help support for the community engagement. But that would be about it. Can I have a show of hands for the report? Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Moving on now to the sustainability appraisal.
Thank you very much, Chair. You'll be pleased to know this is the third and final part of not all of our presentations tonight, but certainly the ones involving the local plan. So it really just, as the executive summary says, it's a preparation review of all our policies, making sure they're underpinned by relevant and up-to-date evidence. That's going to be a very key part of what we do. Need to make sure that the plan doesn't cause economic, environmental, or social problems. And there's a system known as the sustainability, something we're very much into, and I know members here have a lot of experience of. So the scoping report really is the first stage in the production of the plan. And we need to obviously make sure there's a thorough understanding of the context of the existing plans that we have and policies and the current current baseline situation, and we need that to predict the effects that the plan is going to have as we go through the next few years. So I think at this point I'm going to hand over to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, apologies. Natalie Elworthy, who should have been presenting this, has tested positive for COVID this morning. So got me again instead, I'm afraid. And for the next one. So the sustainability appraisal in terms of the scoping report is the first legal stage that we would need to go through to actually prepare a local plan update. We are required to carry out both a strategic environmental assessment and a sustainability appraisal under two different sets of legislation. They are most commonly combined together, as we did on the last local plan. The sustainability appraisal itself starts with the document that's in front of you tonight, which is the scoping report, which sets the context for what Huntingdonshire is like now, identifies what the sustainability issues that we are facing at the moment are, and assembles a lot of baseline evidence on which we then move forward from to develop our local plans. It gives us the methodology that we will need to work through. So the sustainability appraisal is very much a systematic and methodological process all the way through. It is iterative at each stage of local plan preparation as well, once we get beyond the very first sort of issues and options type documents. We as a council have traditionally done this in-house ourselves. Some councils do contract it out to consultancies to do. The preference here is to do it ourselves because that way we understand and test our own policies, and we can then make our own iterative changes to policies to improve them as we go, rather than having to draft a version of the local plan, hand it over to a set of consultants, wait 6 weeks for them to give us the answers back, and then put it out for consultation. It helps us improve our own policies much better doing it ourselves. It also gives us a bit more flexibility, to be quite frank. And stands us in good stead when we get to the examination, because of course it's us that the inspector is asking questions about it. And should we fall over on the sustainability appraisal, we don't get past day one of the examination, basically. So what you've got in the quite substantial appendix are all the findings of the baseline work that we've done, all the plans, policies, programs that we will need to look at and take account of to make sure that we're aligned with national, regional policies, and even some international ones going forwards into the local plan. We summarise in Chapter 5 all the sustainability issues and problems that we've identified for each of those topics, which comes under Task 3 of the sustainability appraisal, A3, sorry. And then we produced a set of sustainability objectives, which are what we will then use to test the local plan, each policy, each allocation as we move forward. You will see that there are different iterations for the strategy as a whole, for development management policies, and for site allocations, because trying to get a single question that you can sensibly ask and answer to each of those different strands really doesn't work well. You tend to end up with incredibly generic questions that then add no value to the process. So you will find that we've got 3 different sets of questions in there. I think there's little more to say by way of introducing it, other than it will be a lengthy process to actually carry out. It is a valuable process, in my opinion, and this is the first stage. Again, we are only legally obliged to consult 3 statutory bodies of, I always get this wrong, the Environment Agency, Historic England, and Natural England. That's the other one. But again, it's best practice to consult more widely on it. So it's the second of these three documents that we would actually propose putting out for consultation, again for that 6 weeks, so that the two consultations are aligned, and people can look at them at the same time and to the same deadlines without thinking, now which one's that week and which one's the next week, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. I can understand a lot of work went into it. Are there any questions? Councillor Gardner.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, it's an excellent report. Just looking at one particular item, though, where we've got community facilities in Huntingdonshire with regard to community centres and village halls, there seems to be a lack of village halls and community centres shown in the west of the county, in particularly in my division of my county division, where I know there are village halls. So I would hate for you to come unstuck at the first hurdle there if when it gets inspected, because there are other village halls there. It would be helpful if you'd actually had the village locations where you'd got the dots for the community centres and what have you, because I think that would help anybody looking at the plan as to where those particular village halls and community centres are. So that was my first, my one quick spot going through. Otherwise,
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Just a small point that I've picked up on the non-technical summary, page 7, under population and health. You say there's going to be an emphasis on building 1 and 2 person dwellings, but there's a lot of families out there at the moment that are waiting a very long time for larger properties. So should we not be doing a lot more to support those?
If I can just clarify, at this stage, there's no decision in terms of the proportion of dwellings of different sizes that we would be looking for in a policy. That will very much fall out of the issues engagement that will follow later in the year. The only evidence-based document we have on that is about 2 or 3 years old now, and that does recognise, because of the increasing older population, that there is a growth in the smaller households. Sorry, I'm not quite certain the link to the health section.
It's just the heading that you've listed the point under. It says population and health.
Okay. Councillor Gray.
Yeah, I'd again say thank you. It's a very comprehensive report, and you only have to start looking through it to realise the sort of impact it has on all of us, really. So, just a few technical questions, if I might, just to help me through it, really. Firstly, the first question that I had that you've actually answered is there a different way that we could do this? And obviously, going to consultants and getting consultants to do it is one way of doing it. I happen to think that your way of doing it is probably the better way of doing it. But my exhortation would be keep, as I'm sure you do, looking at what the consultants are doing for other authorities to see if you can nick any good ideas or good presentational ideas off them for nothing. I'm sure you do that anyway. I thought you might have done, so I'm merely encouraging that. Can I just ask a question around figure 1.1, which is this flow chart of the sustainability assessment process alongside the local plan production? And forgive me, it's under introduction, page 13 of the document, not the not the pack. So are we before? This is not stage A at the moment, is it? This is pre-stage A. Sorry.
Yes, to confirm, this is stage A in terms of setting the context and working out the objectives that we will test the plan against.
Right. Okay. Thank you. In which case, probably how does the place strategy that we were talking about earlier, you can see that the local plan preparation is kind of going alongside that, and they kind of feed into each other as they go through there. The leader is working on a new corporate plan. There are other ambitions that are emerging. How do they kind of feed in to stage A? Because they're quite important foundations, I suspect, for those who are leading the authority, and they're not quite formed at this point in time. So how do you foresee those? I mean, I know it's an iterative process and we can kind of come back and look at it again in the future, but in terms of consulting, having an answer, going back and saying, this is what we heard, we're obviously waiting for some fairly meaty stuff to come out that I think could be quite influential into this process. So again, a comment around timing and how that fits would be useful.
In terms of timing, obviously, this for the sustainability appraisal scoping report is a draft for consultation. It does reference in there the emerging place strategy and the emerging climate strategy because they're not complete yet. As we move through the sustainability appraisal process, post consultation, we will get to finalise this. So we have the opportunity then to make any more updates that have come as that work is further consolidated. When we move through the next few months and we prepare the issues paper, which is the big discursive paper for what people would like to see in the local plan, that is aiming to follow on in timing from the place strategy. So again, we will have a much better idea of what's coming out of the place strategy to feed into that. So we can already say to people, this is what we've heard, this is what the issues we think are that are following on.
So I just wonder, given that I managed to get confused about which stage this was, whether it might be possible to make it absolutely crystal clear to the readers that this is stage A that we're at this point. It says the first in 1.9, the first stage of producing a plan is the scoping stage, which this report relates to. But I didn't know whether it related to framing what a scoping stage would look like. No, it's not. It's the actual scoping stage. And if you may permit me, Chairman, one last question. So the intriguing timeline, of course, goes on and on and on. And stage E, post adoption reporting and monitoring. Now, this legislation, I think I'm right in saying, dates right back to sort of 2004, I think, when it first kind of came in. So I'm curious, and I ought to know the answer to this, and I'm just going to be blatantly honest and say I don't know the answer to it. But I assume that we are already doing some post-adoption reporting and monitoring on stuff that we have done in the past, and that you are using that evidence to kind of formulate and inform what we're doing this time round.
Yes, the sustainability appraisal objectives and indicators, along with those for the local plan, are all reported on annually in the appropriately named annual monitoring report. So yes, they do come through and we will look at those.
Yeah, I think.
Thank you.
Jeff, I could just.
Yes.
The data reporting is very good in the planning department, and yeah, annual monitoring reports, infrastructure, spends, etc. They're all detailed, and they come to this panel, of course, which is a good opportunity. I just want to pick up on a point Councillor Gardner made earlier about village halls. You don't want a village hall in all 25 of your villages each. That's good. That's good. No, I know I'm jesting, but I think I knew what you were hinting at. I know you're a very good advocate for all of those villages.
Have we? Sorry, are you going?
There's just one. When we're looking at the plan for the flood zones, which is very very good, but I just think it would be better for residents and for an inspector if you put on there the names of the rivers, or you had it on a separate plan where people could actually identify where the Alconbury Brook was, where the Ellington Brook was, where the river the other rivers, the River Ouse, just so that it makes life easier to look at both plans going forward. And as we stated in the, it was Alconbury that was one of the worst hit villages back in December 2020. I do think it would have been a good idea to have highlighted that particular village in the report. I know it's highlighted in the report, there's a mention, but we don't actually highlight it on the plan. Says
Yeah. I'll wait. Yeah, thank you for the comments on the flood maps and the mention of Alconbury being one of the worst hit villages. For the size of the map and and the size of the document, it is going to prove quite difficult to put all the names of the rivers and the brooks on there. What I would say is that at the moment we have just started the commencement of a suite of integrated water management studies, which will form a new evidence base based on historic flood events, based on water capacity, based on water supply, which is moving forward and will continue through the preparation of the local plan to provide more up-to-date evidence, which will help us guide the future policies that go into the plan. So although this is a static document in terms of the flood map here, we will be seeing as the years progress, and by the end of next year, we will be seeing an updated version of where these floodplains are and what happens to surface water and what these historic flood events are telling us.
Thanks, Gardner.
That's excellent. If you look at the flood zone map, if you take just the rivers on it and then had a plan prior to the flood zone that showed where the rivers were, I think that the names of the rivers, I think that would just help residents within the district and anybody else looking at the drawing to be able to relate to both. That's all I'm saying. You're not going to get it on the flood zone, but I just think you could do a separate map, really.
I think what I would suggest is that we could provide a slight update to that by providing a link to the webpage, which holds our interactive flooding and water maps for our strategic flood risk assessments, if that would help. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? It's very welcome. I think actually, on the whole, there are no major comments other than the names of the rivers that would go on there, because I think most of the committee, I would say all, are in favour and would recommend this going to cabinet. Can I just have a show of hands, please? Thank you. It's great. Thank you. And thank you for all your effort, the whole team. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, moving on. So we've now got Great Gransden Neighbourhood Plan.
Thank you, Chair. Moving swiftly to Great Gransden, fine place. The Parish Council have done a really good job on this, and they produced a submission version of the neighbourhood plan that was available for comment between the 25th of August and the 14th of October last year. The examiner's report was received on the 30th of November. She suggested some modifications which would meet the conditions. They've now been accepted, and it's considered then that the neighbourhood plan will meet the basic conditions required. Obviously, as we know, there's a referendum that needs to be held. That's a statutory requirement under regulations, 28 days notice, and needs to be held within 56 working days of the decision. So that is planned to be on the 9th of March, which I assume is a Thursday. It normally is. And that'll meet both time requirements and give the residents a chance to make the ultimate decision on this. As we know, if It's in the affirmative. Majority is in the affirmative. Full council will be asked to make the neighbourhood plan at our next meeting after the 9th of March, which will be on the 29th, and that'll become part of the statutory development plan for Huntingdonshire. Any
Thank you, Councillor.
questions at all?
Any comments? Councillor Pickering.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so the neighbourhood plan makes multiple references to the conservation area, which was designated in 1972. Now, the HDC has a duty to periodically review these conservation areas, but I think in the case of Great Gransden, it hasn't been reviewed in 51 years, during which time, obviously, the character of the village has changed a great deal. Clearly, there are consequences for a community which is trying to increase its housing stock, because there's an artificial constraint there, and much of the land in the village that was preserved by the conservation area is no longer in agricultural use. So my question really is whether we think the district council has sufficiently met its obligations to review that conservation area, or can we make a commitment to do so? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The issue of conservation area appraisals is separate to that of neighbourhood plans. They are overseen by our heritage team, which is part of the development management function. So the point you raise about reviewing them, that is certainly on our agenda to look at them. But being quite honest as well, we have to continue that conversation about budget and resource to be able to do that. We have reviewed our conservation areas. We have committed to look at them. We now just need to put a timetable and a budget associated with that in place, and that is an ongoing conversation.
Councillor Gray.
Thank you. I just wanted, I mean, Councillor Saunderson, you said the parish council's done a great deal of work here, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think I would just want to say thank you to, because I suspect it's stretched way beyond the parish council, all those who these plans take hundreds of hours of voluntary work to put together, and you know, I would certainly want to make sure that this panel recorded its thanks to those residents who got involved in doing that, because back to the some of the comments right at the beginning of the meeting, it's that kind of community involvement and community spirit that I think gets stuff done locally and makes our neighbourhoods better. I suppose there's probably just a little, when I go through, whenever I flick on a planning officer's planning inspector's report, that font gives me the kind of makes me worried. And I suppose just as a final point from me this evening, given the backdrop of everything else that we've talked about here, is I think the parish council have done the right thing in terms of they didn't really have any other option but to accept the recommendations that were made to amend it. But it does highlight, I think, one of the great tensions that we're all going to be living with as we go through this local plan process, is that stuff that is really important to residents. So, for example, policy G3 includes a policy where a provision whereby ribbon and greenfield development would not be supported. This could be seen as contrary to exceptions by national policy in the development plan, and it should therefore recognise such exceptions. In other words, very nice idea, but sorry, you can't do it. 4.23, starting with view A, it looks over an undulating landscape. There are field boundaries. I cannot say that the post mill, Grade 2 style lifted building and scheduled monument are particularly obvious. It's fairly typical agricultural landscape of no special merit. That is clearly not what the people who live in Great Gransden feel about it. They feel passionately about the landscape that they've got, but I'm afraid when it comes to sitting before a planning inspector, all of that kind of goes out of the window. And I think it's probably just a very salutary lesson for us all to take on board, is that the things that we think are special and that ought to be preserved and ought not to happen, sadly fall away when we get involved in the interesting world of planning policy. Thank you, Chairman. Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on that, on Great Gransden? I'm a little conflicted actually on this one. in light of Councillor Pickering's comments about are we making any recommendation as to the heritage team looking into this whole issue of the conservation area, or is that something that we couldn't do?
I think it's probably a fair point that it's not directly related to the neighbourhood plan. So
Okay.
I'm sort of happy to take that's
Fine,
being
okay.
looked at by.
If that's the case,
Yeah,
then if
thank
there are
you.
no further comments, we'll make the recommendation to Cabinet. That'll be fine. Can I have show of hands? Thank you. Lovely, thank you. Thank you for that. Moving on to overview and scrutiny work programme.
So just as a change from last month's agenda and going forward, you will note on the agenda front sheet that we've split the work programme into two sections. So one is to review the work programme as it stands at the moment, and the second being to discuss any future planning of items to go onto the work programme or items that you might want to see for information. So just starting with point A and the work programme as it stands at the moment, obviously you've got that in there. Just to give you a quick update, as a meeting was held this evening, a very brief meeting of the review of external appointments to outside organisations group. That draft report is sort of being finalised now, and we anticipate that will be coming to the next meeting, pending any major dramas. So, is there any other questions on the work programme as it stands at the moment? No. And so then moving on to part B of the item, to discuss any future planning of items for the work programme. So I'm conscious that there's only really one subject falling under this panel at the moment. I did circulate the list that had previously been discussed. Was there anything that anybody particularly wanted to come onto there? That's not to say you have to speak now and never have a chance again. This will be a rolling item, and certainly if there's anything that comes up in between time, you can email and we can discuss at the next meeting as well. Any suggestions or thoughts? Obviously, as stuff comes up, I will flag it with the group as well.
I think actually that's right. I think it's going to be iterative. You know, if the committee would like anything, we can certainly add things as we move forward on that. Any Councillor Corney?
I think for just something that we've done previously is when we looked at trying to bring stuff through to scrutiny. It's always been a challenge to bring things forward, isn't it, and then people get engaged. I think it's just trying to pick something there's we can add something to some of the bigger projects that are going on. I mean, it's great sort of picking on one thing, but it's where does that help HTC? Where does it help help the community? I think I think just where we pick on there, let's just make sure that there's more to it than just going through the motions. I think and finding something that we can actually achieve something on. I mean, we've done stuff in the past that we know has not gone anywhere, and it's probably why it's been a bit thin on the ground at times. But
And just to elaborate on that, I have been in discussions with some of the items that we know are coming up to see if there's anything that we can add value to as a scrutiny panel. So where we can do that, we certainly I'm engaging with the officers to try and pull that through for the panel so that we've got that. But obviously I'll update as I get anything further on that for you. Any other questions on that item or points, or maybe think about that for next time?
If I may, Chair, I think we should commit to coming back next month and having all put our thinking caps on as to, because we really ought to be trying to help the executive to the point that's been made. You know, we can have a nice little look at this, that, or the other, but we're in difficult waters, and what can we do to help and add value? I think would be a really important thing for all of us to consider.
Absolutely agree. Well, there are no other issues on the agenda. So I'd like to thank you for your contributions as ever and look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you.